for coming out this afternoon to York University. We're going to speak on Ethiopia, from ancient Kush to the Black Lions. And the person who will start out the presentation is Ashra Kwesi. He's a lecturer and researcher on ancient African history and religion. He's traveled to the African continent, in particular to the Nile Valley, over 26 years, covering the areas of Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, Sudan. And today our focus will be on Ethiopia. He is going to cover areas such as the ancient Kushites, the origin of humanity in Ethiopia. He's also going to discuss the ancient African churches, those of Lalibela, as well as the Zagwe dynasty, and much, much more. He's going to show the cultural connection between Kush and Kemet. So brothers and sisters, please join me in welcoming my netter hetch, my divine husband, Ashra Kwesi.
Hotep. Huh? Your mic on? No, you got it. How's Toronto feel today? Good. The African family, give yourselves another strong hand. You could have stayed home to watch the television. Thank my netter hemp for that introduction, and that means my divine wife, and I, her netter hedge, divine husband. I think when we start to bring our divinity back as a people, I think we will start to see ourselves as a divine people. Is that right? I'm most honored to be back right here in Toronto to lecture to you about not his story, but our story. I think the first time I was here, I lectured on the African origin of civilization and Western Freemasonry. How many of you were here for that lecture? All right, a few of you. And then we came back and we dealt with African history versus biblical myths. Here to make us think, to open up our African genetic memory bank, bringing you visual documentation, as Brother Rad said, from our field research. And then we also came back with the African origin of Christianity to show you how the gangsterism that was moved on Africa. This lecture I generally keep for our educational tours in Ethiopia, but Brother Rad called me and said we would like to deal with Ethiopia. So of course I want to move along with this, but I don't want to take a long time because we have to fit within the time of the program, and sometimes that's difficult for me. And I got a clock up here to stay on time because Mary Ra, she's going to deal with the other part of the presentation from the 19th to the 20th century, which I think is the most profound part of Ethiopia. So we don't want to miss that at all. But I think we should give another strong hand to God Collective. Give them a strong hand. These young brothers and sisters here in the African community are putting their resources and time together to make sure that right here in Toronto that we know our story. They could be out there doing a lot of things, but they chose to do this for you. And of course, that's a lot of time and effort and also resources. I know when we understand the system of racism and white supremacy, the reason why it exists because they fund it. We've got to start to funding our liberation. Is that right? Is that right? I know that when he talked about the filming, this is all we do. We don't work in the system, so I can keep my tongue free. Okay, I don't want to be called in on the job. Mr. Kwesi, we just gave you a raise last week, and we hear you, when I was at UCLA, I didn't want to go through that thing of being called in. And you represent this university, so we don't want you to be talking on this black stuff, this black thing. After all, we're paying you very good here. I didn't want to go through that. So I wanted to make sure that I kept my tongue free, to speak freely and from an independent point of view, brothers and sisters. So of course we have a lot to talk about, and we're going to go through the presentation, and then I'm going to finish up, and then Mary Ra is going to start her portion of the presentation. But before I go on, I want to give recognition to my teacher named Dr. Joseph Yakinen, who I met in 1981. I did not know at that time that I would travel with him 14 years and now continuing the research and field research and taking educational tours back, now 25 years of my life non-stop, to bring it back to you so we can see a visual documentation. So I don't want to take a lot of time, and let me recognize another teacher who was on that trip in 1981. Peace be upon him, Dr. John Henry Clark. I was sitting at the feet of the Grand Masters. And of course, there are many, many others that I can go on to talk about, but we want to keep within the time to deal with the presentation. So I'm going to bring it back to black. And before I go on, I want to make sure we give that beautiful sister, our Ethiopian sister, another strong hand. Wasn't that a beautiful dance she did up here? I'm going back to Ethiopia in December, and she already took me there. I was there in Ethiopia when she was doing that dance. And give our brothers who gave us a strong rap, positive rap, not no destructive rap. We want to deal with the fallopian tube of the Nile Valley. Without the fallopian tube of Africa, you wouldn't even have humanity on the planet Earth. And we deal with the birthplace of humanity. We have to deal with right there where they did their research on anthropology. You know, at one time, Europeans didn't consider Africa to be the home of man. They said Europe was the home of man, and then they said China was the home of man with the Java man. But only when they came into Africa, they found there is where we find the origin of humanity. With these little Africans named the Grimaltes who migrated up out of Africa, and then the news went out around the world about Ethiopia yields the oldest human fossils, right there in the far region of Ethiopia. And here we see they called her Dikenesh, or Lucy rather. When Johansen and others dug her up, they called her Lucy, named her after a Beatles song, but her name was, the Ethiopian name is Dikenesh, meaning thou art wonderful. The discovery of Dikenesh pushed the horizon of woman, which I say womankind because that's who they found there. They always say mankind, but we got to include, because in the African system, it was also based off of the feminine principle as well, back to a distant past. And here in the Addis Ababa Museum, right there we can see that the bipedalism of Dikenesh, showing that she walked upright just like us. We were able to go back to Ethiopia to see some of the earliest remains of our early sister right there in Ethiopia. Now, just recently, they now found a new site. So just like National Geographic said, every time they kick over a rock in Africa, they have to rewrite the textbooks. Right here in Dikika, here we see the earliest child, National Geographic, the earliest child, 3.3 million years old, bones discovered. And although these are their descriptions, that may not necessarily be how she looked, but these are how we get the descriptions. And it says, meet Dikika, the baby, 3 years old from the dawn of humanity. Her discovery holds clues to the origin of early childhood right here in Ethiopia. We see the various stages of humanity. Australopithecus afarensis, hominids include man and his cousin, Australopithecus, Homo habilis, and Homo erectus, as Diop told us. That's Sheikh-Anta Diop, by the way. Hominids were introduced by Australopithecus 3.5 million years ago. But as we get this chart, it always ends up with the European or Caucasoid type as the evolution of Homo sapiens sapien, or man. Recently, CNN, even though they only showed it one day, they recently excavated some fossil skulls of 2 adults and 1 child discovered in the far region of eastern Ethiopia, have been dated at 160,000 years, making them the oldest known fossils of modern humans and Homo sapiens sapiens. And then when they reconstructed this fossil, they only showed it one day. When they reconstructed it, this is what he looked like. Here we see our brothers right here. Adultu, who means the elder. So long before the Adam and Eve story that they're trying to put Adam and Steve on you today, African people were the first people on the planet Earth. Going back thousands upon thousands of years, they don't know your birth record. And he's now in the Addis Ababa National Museum, and there they also show how the evolution of humanity, they show the various races making their transitions out of Adultu, and again, starting with him. So again, when we talk about the Adam and Eve story,
we see that long before the Adam and Eve story that came about much later, this story of the early Africans came up out of the Nile Valley. And they show that evolutionary stage right there in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. These maps of the Omo Valley region, the oldest modern humans, 195,000 years old, coming up out of this region, as I said, migrating around the world from the early documentation that we see here today. Right there in the fallopian tube of the Nile Valley, African people migrate out all over the world. At one time, this was a black planet. So we talk about black power, we're talking about the time when the planet was all black. We're talking about a time when we see those early Gamaldis who migrated up out of Africa, migrated into Europe, migrated into Asia, migrated into Far East Asia and Australia. So here we see the various times that out of various mutations took place. This is how we have the variations that you see of races around the world today. Those early Gamaldis who migrated into Europe during the Ice Age, here they got trapped there, and this is what created the Cro-Magnon man. This is the Muanthropoid type. Now, I make up my own scientific terms. After all, Europeans called us Negroids and Pigatoids. We didn't ask if those were our names. So we understand it in the Eve, the mitochondrial mother. They've even found that research have found that you can trace humanity back to the early African woman in the Nile Valley. She's definitely the queen of the universe, and from her, she gave birth to humanity. We also look at Genesis, which is a Greek word that means the beginning. And right there in the Taneta land, right there in the Kui land, known as the Spirit land, our ancestors came up out of the Nile, and even when we look at Genesis, it even speaks of and opens up with Ethiopia. And Genesis chapter 2, a river went out of Eden to water the garden. And then the 13th verse, it says, and the name of the second river is Gihon, the same as it that compasses the whole land of Ethiopia. Here we see the first nation is still with us today. It's spoken of right there in Genesis chapter 2, verse 13, right there in the Bible. Greece is not mentioned. Rome is not mentioned. We're talking about Ethiopia is mentioned right here. Making my travels in those early days, in the early 80s with Dr. Ben, up there into the highlands of Ethiopia. And here as we took the flight up, and as I looked down and saw the river compassing the whole land of Ethiopia as it comes out of Lake Tana, here it reminded me how it said in the biblical records that the river compasses the whole land of that of Ethiopia. I was able to witness here Gihon, the Blue Nile, compassing the whole land of Ethiopia as we took our flight up. We understand as we look and see this region right here is where that river flows out from Lake Tana and flows through Ethiopia. Understanding when we see the Tisaset waterfalls in Bahadar that I've visited many times, unfortunately the waterfalls are not as they are now because of the dams, but you can truly see that this was the land of the garden. If there was a Garden of Eden, this was truly the garden, even as we get the biblical account that Moses also came into the land of Ethiopia, in fact took a Cushite daughter. This is long even before Solomon and Makeda that I will deal with later. As we look and see the beautiful waterfalls here, and see truly this was the sacred land, that even in ancient Kemet they looked at this as the Kui land, the spirit and sacred land of our ancestors. Here is where they also acknowledged and gave homage to this land right here. It's up out of Ethiopia, which was the mother of it all, that came up out of the Nile and spread civilization down the Nile that we're going to deal with. Now, when we look at this comparison and understand the Bible dictionary, the racist term that was created at the Conference of Jamnia in 90 AD, where they created the Ham story, because that's what was created at the Conference of Jamnia in 90 AD, and ended up in the Babylonian Talmud in 550 AD. And this racist allegorical story, it talks about the curse of Ham, because Ham was drunk and naked and saw his father, Noah, drunk and naked. Supposedly he was cursed, okay, because he witnessed his father in this condition. But it goes on to say he became the progenitor of the dark races. Then they go on to say in the dictionary, not the Negroes, but the Egyptians, Ethiopians, Libyans, and Canaanites. Now, wait a minute now, not the Egyptians, not the Ethiopians, so here you see in Webster's, is designating Ethiopia as Negro, as African black man, but when you take a critical analytical analysis, all of a sudden, when they tried to say, well, these are not black people here, these are actually black Caucasians. Although they're black Caucasians. This is part of the psychopathic racism to remove anything that's relevant to Africa somewhere else, or change even the identity of the people. even their early books and the real facts about Ethiopia by J.A. Rogers, he eagerly tells us how Europeans have always tried to take and move the people, in some cases the culture and the monuments out of Africa. J.A. Rogers points out right here that the Ethiopians, according to these writers, are Semitic, Hamitic, Caucasian, without a single drop of Negro blood. So this is the racism that was created to try to move African people away to somewhere else. Kind of like a thing called passing the day, where they've psychologically conditioned some black folks' mind to think that they are not black or they are not Africans. So the same thing is also done on the African continent. Now, through my research, I have returned back. Now, returning back to the area of Jinka and doing my own anthropological work, because we can't depend on Discovery to tell us this. We can't depend on National Geographic. So I have made many trips, as I said, with Dr. Ben, and also taken our educational tours up into the highlands and regular tour route. But I wanted to go deep back to Africa. I went back over 50,000 years here, going back to see all of Africa, not just bits and pieces of Africa. And taking this little flight down, I selected 7 brothers that could handle this. And I was also told that we were the first and only black group that ever came here. We're not talking about living in hotels now. We're talking about going back to the bush. We're going back to see all of Ethiopia now. And camping here, where we had to make camp, and Mungo National Park in the Omo Valley in Ethiopia. This was in 2006 of last year. And here are some of the brothers that I selected to go on this special trip, because I knew that everybody could not handle this. But it was a beautiful trip. And we see that our camp was invaded by baboons. And as we slept in the tents, I could hear the sound of ooh, ooh. And I asked our guide that day, the scout, what was that noise? He said, those were the lions. This is how far back we had to go. So let's go back to Africa. And here, one of the baboons said, Kwesi, I got to have a discussion with you. We got to talk. I said, talk about what? Because we called you Mhetet Ra in Kemet. He said, I got some issues, and he got his boys, so I had to listen as they surrounded me in the camp. And I listened closely to what he was saying. He said, we were deified in Kemet. He said here, they said that animal worship, it was about showing the attributes with Matnechet or Mother Nature, and showing that we were one with nature. And ancient Kemet displayed that on the ancient monuments, because we were the first to give praise to Ra, as we praise to the east on the monuments that we put on the Tekanus that represented resurrection. That's what Mhetet Ra was trying to tell me, that we were placed right there on the monuments. So we saw that we were close with Matnechet, nature. Not like the Europeans who tried to conquer nature, but showing that we were one with the spiritual forces, as you see the Medu Neter, the world's first language on the Tekanus right there, as I listened to Mhetet Ra tell me how our ancestors deified him closely. And I said, I'll make sure I will tell your story. In the camp, we had to go back. And we went to various nations, okay, like the Musi, and also the Hammer, and the Kuro, and the Bume that I'm going to show you in a second. And we went to the oldest brothers. We had to go through a path, a rocky path, and go up to the bush and up to the mountains. It was hard getting there. And we went back over 50,000 years. We went back in time, and we came to the Ethiopian Musi. Here we see the brothers here with the feathers on their head that we still see on the temples of Kemet. And here we see the brothers are here still one with Matnechet. That's why we called the land the Kui land, the spirit land. And ancient Kemet said this was the land of God. As we saw the Musi, we see that the Musi are here. And you see them with the guns, and we discussed with them, and they asked us, through the translator, they said, are you still fighting slavery? And we looked at each other and said, are we still fighting slavery? And then they looked at through the translator, and told us, well, they have no weapons. That's why they cannot fight slavery, okay? And they said, well, we'll give you some guns so you can go and fight slavery, okay? So they gave us some guns so we could go fight slavery. So the slavery of the mind, so the Musi wanted to know if we were still fighting the slavery that is going on in the mind here. These were the baddest brothers. We had to go way out to the bush, up into the mountain. It was hard getting there. Let's speak of Africa. Let's speak of all of Africa. Let's stop letting Europeans talk to us about Africa. Let's go back to the ancient texts where it said this was the Taneter land, this was the Holy Land, and let's go back to the oldest people and stop looking at them as something's wrong with them. You can't go back in time like others, as they used the lip plates, because the lip plates were used to ward off slave traders that came there. And they still use it as a style today. So we went back into time. And here we see our sister who was Matnechet. Here we see her here because it is through her choreography and the movement that would create the rain and create the crops to grow. That's why she has the corn on her head and had the leaves in her hand, as we see her right here with the lip plate. And as I say, this may have been where the original cornrows started, right here. As we see our brothers and sisters here going back thousands upon thousands of years. That means if you go back to ancient Kemet, and as during the time of ancient Kemet over 3,000 and 4,000, 5,000 years ago, their life did not change at all. After it's all said and done on this planet, and they get done blowing up everything, they will still be here to start it all over again. The Ethiopian Hammer Nation, there we see another nation of people. They were down on the lowlands, okay? Again, they were not as aggressive as the Musi, but still a very beautiful people. This area that I was at is in the area called Jinka. Most of our travels is up in this area of Bahadar and Aksum and Lalibela and Addis Ababa. But this is the area last year I went down into Jinka, down to the dawn of time, and this area right here where I was able to get with the hammer. But what's beautiful about the hammer, as I observed from my empirical observation through my research, I was able to see how the culture of the Kushite culture, the Kushite Kemetic culture, came up from them. They're the ones that migrated down the Happy Nile, called the White Nile today, and also the Atbar, and also the Blue Nile. As you look closely at the Kushite Ta-Nehisi, we can see the culture came up from them. They're the ones that brought it down the Nile. They're the ones that carried the culture down the Nile. They're the ones who the people who became the Kemetic Africans that reached the zenith of civilization in Kemet. We look closely and see that our Hammer sisters here, and look at the hairstyle that she has. It's identical to the Kushites as the hairstyle that you see here. These are the things that Europeans cannot tell us, because they're not having the spiritual connection with the culture of Africa, as we see the Kushite Ta-Nehisi, called the Nubians today, as they're called. The Ethiopian Oromo Hammer village, as we went back and see, these are our beautiful brothers and sisters who are still with Mutnechet. They're not taking pills for high blood pressure. They're not taking pills for breast cancer. All these things that we're victimized by today, then they live totally with Mutnechet, because the creator, divine creator that we knew by many names, provided everything for them right there. And we went to also to the Ethiopian Oromo Binu village also. Here we see the Binu people right here, beautiful sisters here, although a little bit different from the Hammer, also different from the Musi, but still an African people of the Nile Valley. But they're not, this has nothing to do with no heathen or anything that you've been taught. They are close with the earth. It's good to get into the culture to see the beautiful, diverse brothers and sisters in Ethiopia. And we go back to the Gala, or the Kushite. And we look at the Kushite, or the Kushite groups. They were the Gala, the Oromo, Somalia, and also the Afar and Agu. When you look at the Agu, they are the earliest people up out of this region. The Ge'ez language, although they tell us it came from the Sabaean, that they try to say it was associated with the Greek, but actually that language came from Agu, an older language that came from the Kushites, who laid down the earliest civilization of the Nile Valley. Now keep in mind, ancient Ethiopia was much larger than the country that you see now that we'll see in a minute. Now when you look and see some of the indigenous brothers in the southern part and sisters in the southern part of Ethiopia, here that was later looked at as the feather of Ma'at. Truth, justice, and righteousness associated with an African goddess that goes all the way back to the Kushites, especially when you see the artwork and see the early Kushites with the feather, and our Kushite Nubian paintings are identical to our brothers and sisters, in the Kushite region and the southern part of Ethiopia. Now we're talking about the indigenous culture of the Nile Valley. How did Kemet, that means black, that you may know as Egypt, how did ancient Kush, after all, Kemet came from Kush. We're talking about a fallopian tube of culture here that spread down the Nile. That means that we are all one culture. Egypt is not separated from Kush. Kush is not separated from Ethiopia. They are all tied together. We cannot tear. We can't come in like white folks and tearing apart the African family. After all, Ethiopia is the mother, so how can you tear the daughter, Egypt, away from Ethiopia? When you see the leopard skin and understand the culture, and see the culture and look and take a critical analytical analysis of the Sin priest who did the opening of the mouth ceremony, where did the culture come from?
came from the beginning. It spread down the Nile. It did not come from the north or somewhere else. It came up out of Africa. When you understand the culture and the various brothers and sisters like the Oromo, who are also called the Gala, who are the largest group in Ethiopia. And then also we have the Oromo sister here with the Jinka with the large bowl on her head in the southern part of Ethiopia, and another group called the Aga. The Aga are associated with the Kalis, which are some of the earliest Hebrew people. That means Ethiopia was an ancient Hebrew nation, especially when we get the accounts that I'm going to talk about later, that you have many biblical accounts associated with how Hebrew religion came into Ethiopia. If we go back to Abraham, he marries a Cushite African named Hagar. If we look at Joseph, he also marries a Cushite. And then they have sons named Ephraim and Manasseh. And the Kalas associated their lineage with Ephraim. So they're associated with Ephraim. And then also we see Moses also took a Cushite woman. And then later we're going to talk about Solomon. So this is a whole legacy of all of them coming in, taking African Cushite women. And then, of course, we know them as the Beta Israel and the Phalashas from Gondar of Ethiopia. As we look and see the Hafar region, the nomads of northeastern part of Ethiopia, and we see here, this is in the eastern region of Ethiopia. So we see a very diverse group of brothers and sisters as we look at the Afar sisters right here in northeastern part of Ethiopia. Then we see the Amhara, are the second largest group in Ethiopia. They play the lead role in Ethiopian politics. Europeans call the Amharic the Hamitic group, but they're the second largest group. And the circle you see is the Amhara, and these are the areas that they occupy in Ethiopia. In fact, here we see our Amharic sisters right here, and they are the largest Christian group as well. But the sister that you see right in the middle, she looks just like my sister Lavon. In fact, they can pass for twins. As we see the Amharics, again, the Amharic, the official language of Ethiopia, and the name of its people are the Amharic language, even though the language goes back to an earlier language called the Agu, where the Ge'ez language took from the Agu, even though they try to say the Ge'ez language came to Sabaean, but ignoring the Cushite Agu. Also, we see the Tagri. This is the third largest group of Ethiopia. They lived in the Tagri province of Eritrea. And we look at the culture of that area. We can see our Tagrian sisters who have their hair back, and some of us have hairstyles out here, and you don't even know that your genetic memory bank gave you that hairstyle. You know, you naturally start getting African braids and start to look like some of the brothers and sisters on the African continent that Mary Ra is going to show you as well. That's showing an African genetic memory bank that's taking place. As we see our Tagrian brother here is identical with the hairstyle, also with ancient Kush. And then also the Lalibela region. We see the Aga, who were converted from the Hebrew faith into the Ethiopian Christians in the area of Lalibela. The Hora region, very colorful brothers and sisters, the Oromo Hora woman that you see right here. So again, we've got to have a holistic view and looking at Africa and stop separating it and segregating it down to just little pieces. We see the Ogaden region. The Somali is the fourth largest group. They live in the Ogaden region of eastern Ethiopia. The Somali are the largest Muslim group in this particular region. And we see the Somali brother that you see right here. And here we see a Somali sister from the Ogaden region. And very beautiful sister that you see right here. This is what makes Ethiopia so beautiful. I show all the various cultures so we can see ourselves as a collective people, just as we are right here in this room. That's how we are also with Ethiopia. Now keep in mind that Ethiopia enabled the survival of the Hebrew faith. It has enabled the survival of Christianity and Islam. All three of them, none of them would not have been able to survive without Ethiopia. All you got to do is read the history. We'll talk about Menelik in a minute, who also brought the Hebrew faith into Ethiopia. And then we also see that many of the Christians who were persecuted had to flee into Ethiopia. And then it was Prophet Muhammad, who was being persecuted by the Quraysh, who had to come to Ethiopia to save Islam, because if they did not come to Ethiopia during that time, then there would not have been an Islam. Now, although Grum, the left-handed, he came in much later in the 1600s and started to exterminate many of the Christians during that time, even though Prophet Muhammad said, Ethiopia is the one land that you do not touch because they saved us from extermination, although Graham violated that position during that time. Ethiopia today is not the Ethiopia as it used to be in ancient times. In fact, it expanded many countries. Although we see
the Sudan to the west, and Eritrea to the north east, and we see Somalia, okay, to the east, and Kenya to the south. These are the countries that border Ethiopia. But in ancient times, Ethiopia expanded a much larger region than it does today. Eritrea is a result of what Mussolini and others came in and separated the land. Now, when we look at, although, that gives me time to clear my throat. Now we see that when you go to the biblical account, we see that it speaks of Cush as Ethiopia. Mesarem was Egypt. Canaan is the present-day Israel. Punt is the sacred land, and that was the Taneter land. Even when we look at the biblical account that although it's an allegorical racist myth, the sons of Ham was Cush, Mesarem, Punt, and Canaan. And then we see that Cush had a son named Nimrod. He was a mighty hunter, and he ruled over areas of Babel, Acadia, and also Shinar. So when you look at these maps, Cush, from the biblical account, ruled over, or ancient Ethiopia, all this ancient land, even from the biblical accounts. Drusilla Houston Dungy talked about the civilization went down the Nile, took up also all of Egypt, also covered the Kushite Arabia, also the Tigris Euphrates, and also all the way to India. The Greeks, when you look at the origin of the word Ethiopia, the earliest use of the word Ethiopia is found in the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer of the 9th century BC, although when the Greeks came in, how did they come up with the word? It goes back to Ethiopia, which they saw was a jet black king from Ethiopia, and this is how we get the name Ethiopia from Ethiopia. That's one of the legends of how that name came to be. The Greek Pliny stated that Ethiopia was derived from Ethiops, meaning the glowing or the black face of Ethiopia. And then also the ancient Ethiopians never referred to themselves as Ethiopians or their land Ethiopia, nor did the ancient Egyptians call the land Ethiopia. It was called ancient Cush, Kenet and Nefer, and other lands, names. When you understand when we look at the areas of land that the Greeks referred to as Ethiopia. Now we look and see that the Greeks applied Ethiopia and the Ethiopians to the land in both Africa and Asia, to the land of the sunrise and the sunset. They also looked and saw that in ancient times, the black-skinned people or Ethiops constituted populations of Arabia, Mesopotamia, Persia, and India. This is Greeks. These are the Greeks giving that documentation. A great world empire that we have not known the true story about. Homer alluded to the Ethiopians of two continents that he referred to as one was situated towards the sunrise that I said a minute ago, and the other towards the sunset. So they clearly saw that this was a massive and great land, and Herodotus referred to the eastern Ethiopians as and western Ethiopians. Let's look at the old maps. The old maps show the whole continent of Africa as what? Ethiopia. So here, when you look at these old maps, the Greeks were right. The whole southern part of the continent of Africa was Ethiopia. Then there was the eastern Ethiopia. And then also, do you know that the Atlantic Ocean was not called the Atlantic Ocean, it was called Ethiopia. They came in and changed all these names. When we look at the Battle of Ottawa by Murray Rao, we'll get deeper into that part of the lecture. Pamela Brown points out, according to an Ethiopian tradition, the word Ethiopia is derived from Ethiopius, a name of an Ethiopian king, the seventh of the ancestral line of the Aksumite rulers. The Ethiopian book of Aksum identifies him as Ethiopius. So that gives credit to where Greek Pliny stated the Ethiopia is derived from the Ethiops, meaning the glowing and the black face. That's Ethiopius. That was the original name of Ethiopia, how the Greeks came up with Ethiopia. Let's look at the ancient Egypt and Cush. There were 5 separate kingdoms of ancient Ethiopia. Tasseti, that goes back 25,000 years, according to Keith Seal and Bruce Williams at the Orange Institute in Chicago, where they did excavations in Quisto to validate that African people, okay, in the kingdom of Kemet goes back over 25,000 years. We also see that the kingdom of Cush, or Karma, that's 2,500 years, or 1500 BCE. And also Napata, 1,000 to 600 BCE, and Medawe around 500 to 300 AD, and Aksum around 1,000 BCE to around 900 AD. But when you look at Kemet, or ancient Egypt as it's called but today, the names for Ethiopia were names like Tasseti. Tasseti was the land of the bull that goes back 26,000 years from Europeans' research.
of the Royal Institute in Chicago with Keith Steele and Bruce Williams. Also, we look at the land of Taneter. This was referred to as God's land, the sacred land. That means ancient Egypt gave praise to the south. Why? Because they saw that's where their origin came from. Then also we see Ta-Nehisi is referred to as Nubia. Nubian came about during the time of the Greeks. The earliest mention of it is with Strabo, but the name was called Ta-Nehisi. And then also we see Kenet Henefer is another name that means Cush from the 18th dynasty. And then Cush was also called Cush in the Hebrew Bible, and Kashada of the first king of the 25th dynasty, that's where it was named after, and also it predated him as well. And this goes back to the Cushites. We see that Wawet was the name of Lower Nubia, Yam was the name of Upper Nubia. Also we see that Punt was the name of the land located east of Upper Nubia, bordering on the Red Sea. That was the present day Ethiopia, or Dallas, okay? This area right here was the area of Punt. That was the spirit land or the Taneter land. When we look at the earliest sculptures that we have of Ethiopia, of the Taseti, of 26,000 years of this kingdom, and this piece is about 7,000 years old. These were the pre-dynastic Africans. We're an ancient African people. That's what we've got to understand. He's holding the ancient Sekhem. That means that he has the power, the authority to rule the throne. So when you go to Kemet and see Pepi of the 6th dynastic period over 4,000 years ago, he's holding the ancient Sekhem. All you got to do is follow the culture once you know your story. And then when you understand, as we go back, Mary Ra and I, and we do our field research with our groups, and from our own empirical observation of our African culture, and seeing that it's not separated, then you can see the culture still goes on even to this very day. Even to this day with our elder in the highlands of Ethiopia. You can't segregate yourself down to just a little piece and portion. You got to go back. As we go back and go to Kolobolo and Ta-Nehisi, called Nubia today, that was also part of Ethiopia in ancient times. And here we see from the pre-dynastic stones that show that this was one time land that had green. It was not a desert. It was fertile land. And we see elephants. We see giraffes and all types of animals. Can you see the elephant there? Now, elephants cannot survive in a desert. That tells us that this was one time a very green land. But we want to also see the culture and see they carved right here the Sultan or king holding what is the Sekhem. Thousands of years ago. That once you understand the culture, to show that it's still passed down as we go to Bahadar in Ethiopia holding the Sekhem. This carved in stones thousands of years ago. Somebody knows something